Jesus was out roaming around again. He did an awful lot of roaming, more than some cell phones. And here he is up in the northern reaches. He has a strange experience. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers. I wonder how often that's been done. That would have been a whole different story. 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." And when he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." So ends the reading of God's holy word.
Thanks be to God.
Let's pray. Gracious and eternal God, we don't really encounter lepers or leopards, for that matter, these days. So perhaps at the very first, this story seems a little strange. But we also know that your sacred texts contain blessings for our lives, even now, today, in the Western Hemisphere and in this area of the world. And so with that confidence, we lean upon your wisdom to bring to our awareness and to our lives that word of hope and encouragement and faith that we need through this sacred text. We ask this in your holy name. Amen. Well, the one thing that I love and hate about Jesus is that he refused to stay in his comfort zone. At the point that we join him today, he's heading off into the outer limits, the very fringes of Jewish territory up north, where there was a very good chance he'd run into the dreaded Samaritans. The stock phrase was that Jews had no dealings with Samaritans, and with good reason. With good and very old reason. Here in the United States, we are familiar with the Hatfields and the McCoys, 2 feuding families who tangled for about 30 years, the end of the 19th century, right along the West Virginia-Kentucky border. Their animosity is legendary, and they knew something about long-term fighting. Well, up here, where we're going with Jesus today, at the border of Samaria and Galilee, where Jesus really had no business being in the first place, a feud had existed not for 30 years, not for 300 years, but for 700 years. Going all the way back to the time when the Assyrians, a neighboring country, had invaded Samaria, this northern kingdom. They confiscated anything that they could get their hands on, laid waste to the communities, and then had the audacity to pollute the ranks of the Jews with all sorts of non-Jewish DNA. So when Jesus enters this brackish, tainted social water of Samaria, he's already courting disaster, at least in the eyes of any vigilant Jew. But then things go from bad to worse. Jesus not only encounters Samaritans, he meets up with lepers, sick with that socially repugnant disease that many assumed was a judgment from God. It was somehow brought upon themselves by some dark and hidden sin. But of course the disease didn't care a lick about political and social boundaries. It's an equal opportunity affliction. So this group of lepers consisted of both Samaritans and Jews. funny what suffering can do to break down walls. How people can come together in a way they might not normally if they share a common affliction. Distinctions of nationality, culture, and even language sometimes don't matter anymore, because they're all in the same boat. And that boat's sinking, and everybody needs to bail. But even though they had each other in this tiny community of suffering, it was excruciating to have leprosy because of the isolation it brought from the larger community. People were deemed unclean, forced to distance themselves from the community, and they couldn't even quietly slink away. They were required to publicly declare their sin whenever anyone came near. And declare they did. And as the rabbi came near, they declared it again. But they must have believed something about this one, because they pinned some pretty high hopes upon Jesus. And they called out, asking for mercy. Who did they think they were, anyway? Asking for mercy. You got to keep in mind, leprosy was considered a scourge straight from the hand of God. Know your place, beggar. Your lot was ordained by the Almighty. Don't get uppity. So it was something of a miracle that the 10 cried out in the first place. But there may be something very empowering about being in the presence of love, that we start to dare to dream about something better, maybe even to plead for something better, work for something better. Can I kind of challenge you to reflect in your own life upon a time when you were in the presence of someone who inspired you to seek something better? Or maybe seek something for your family or your community. But be assured, sometimes these people that are so inspirational can be dangerous. They were dangerous to folks who saw leprosy as ordained by God. Dangerous to anyone who insists that what is must be. Dangerous to anyone afraid of visions or dreams. It's hard to know how the 10 lepers mustered up the hope and then the voice to cry out. But they did, and Jesus heard. But here, I think it's really important to pay attention to the sequence of events that follow their crying out. Jesus immediately instructs them to go and show yourselves to the priests. What we must understand is that priests could not heal. All priests could do was verify that healing had happened. So to put a modern spin on it for you, imagine yourself crying out to Jesus, saying, "Jesus, the water in my well is polluted because of the summer's drought." And Jesus responds this way, "Go and take a sample of your water to be tested." We might say, "Well, wait a minute, Jesus, you're missing the point here. My water is polluted. What good's a test?" But that's what the lepers were asked to do. And then, once they were underway and started, it was then that they found themselves healed. Not too long ago, I watched a new incarnation of the Peter Pan story. I guess it was released last year. In this version, Peter learns how to fly only when a friend of his is plummeting toward death. And Peter dives after him to save his friend's life. And then, of course, the story ends very happily with Peter aided by countless fairies and pixies who assist in defeating the evil pirates. But the point is, Peter needed to take the plunge first. Computer-generated imagery is amazing. Everybody can fly with CGI. There, we can make a bumper sticker out of that. But the deeper truth is that suspending those heavy voices of doubt and disbelief really can put wings on our feet and allow us to do things we never thought possible. We don't have to jump off a cliff to save a friend to see it happen. I'm going to use an ordinary, familiar illustration here. But from the moment we purchase our turkeys, and we ask our volunteers, and we post our signs, and we put on our white shirts and our black slacks, and we plug in the amplifiers, and we heat up the ovens, we're taking the plunge. 300 don't have to show up. Could have 5 show up. When we dare to say hi to a stranger, or even a friend, opening our ears and our hearts to what they have to say, we're making a leap. Essentially, we're calling out to Jesus to give us what we need in that moment. And when we do find Jesus there, in that encounter, in that conversation, bearing us up, giving us what we need, carrying us through, that's when the gratitude starts. That's when the abhorrent Samaritan turns everything on its head, spins around, falls at the feet of Christ, and says, "Thank you." If it's true that when nothing is ventured, nothing is gained, it's also true that when everything is ventured, everything can be gained. And apparently, the Samaritan, the foreigner, the persona non grata, knew this too, and he simply had to say thank you. It's a little story I want to share with you about a minister from some time past. He's deceased now. His name is Reverend Willie Stidger. It's a story about Willie and a favorite teacher he had in grade school. One Thanksgiving, long after he'd grown up, Stidger decided to write this teacher a Thanksgiving letter, letting her know how much she meant to him. He wrote the letter, he dropped it in the mail. He didn't hear anything for quite a long time. And apparently the letter had been forwarded a number of times before it finally reached the teacher, which it did. And in her reply, she said this: "My dear Willie, I cannot tell you how much your note meant to me. I'm in my 80s, living alone in a small room, cooking my own meals, lonely, and like the last leaf of autumn lingering behind. You will be interested to know that I taught school for 50 years, and yours is the first note of appreciation I ever received. It came on a blue, cold morning, and it cheered me as nothing has in years." Those whom society had discarded were given a voice in the presence of Christ. And they, in turn, heard the voice of Christ. They heard it so distinctly that at least one of them had to return to that voice with thanksgiving. Most of us, fortunately, don't have leprosy. Most of us won't learn to fly, either with or without a plane. But all of us have the power of gratitude. And when the problems of the world loom large, and we wonder what we can do, don't underestimate the power of gratitude. It changes things. Pooh's tiny friend, Piglet, wasn't very powerful. But it is said that Piglet noticed that even though he had a very small heart, with capital letters, it could hold a rather large amount of gratitude. And sometimes our little hearts can't even hold all that gratitude, and it spills out all over the place, making a lovely mess. Perhaps like that one leper who could not be silenced, could not be contained. And so we turn around, we fall at the feet of Christ, and we give thanks out loud, and in so doing, bless the world. Amen.